and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. A senior White House official says the U.S. policy on North Korea has been effective and prudent, indicating the U.S. will stay the course with the current policy. In response to North Korea's missile tests, the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, in synchronized action, imposed sanctions on North Korean individuals and entities for their support to the country's weapons programs. Today, we take stock of the Biden administration's policy toward North Korea.
The ways in which we've been able to work together quite effectively, more effectively, I would argue, than at any point in recent memory on a trilateral basis.
Thus far, they have shown no desire to really put the kind of pressure on Pyongyang that we know they could put.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the deputy national security advisor and the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Also joining us, Mr. Robert Rapson. Mr. Rapson served as a charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul until July 2021. He was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy Seoul. Mr. Rapson was also the Director for Korean Affairs at the State Department. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell said that he was asked if U.S. may reconsider its North Korean policy, and he said that the policy has been effective and prudent. If North Korea fired record number of 63 ballistic missiles this year and is preparing to conduct 7th nuclear test, how is this policy effective?
It is effective in that it is prudent. I think that those two words have to be put together. Kurt Campbell is a real expert. He should be taken seriously, but the point is the administration basically is taking a de minimis position on the North Korean systems and the North Korean efforts to ever improve its nuclear weapons capability. We don't have any real initiative underway to try to move to a stated goal of the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We've seen two administrations of the last four, the Trump and Bush administrations, try very, very hard without real success. Actually, the Clinton administration did as well. We do not see that same enthusiasm in the Biden administration, but it's also in a different context. Up until recently, the whole context has been treating either North Korean nuclear missiles or the Iranian program or refugees or terrorism or trafficking in people as individual problems in a post-conflict era after 1989. But the Biden administration acknowledges openly it is now in a great power of strategic competition. And individual situations within that context, such as North Korea, have to be looked at not only by themselves, but also vis-a-vis Russia and China, two close partners of North Korea, in our overall policy. So it is perhaps best to have a prudent policy, even though it doesn't produce much efficient results, because that's where we are.
Now, Mr. Rapson, Mr. Campbell also said our best approach is to ensure that we're in fact in lockstep with South Korea and Japan. And National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also said that the three countries have been working together most effectively in recent memory. Now, is this the only option left for United States at this moment to coordinate with the allies? And when has ever U.S. not coordinated with its allies in the past 30 years in dealing with North Korea?
Well, it's not the only option, but it's certainly the most important option. And I believe the Biden administration has gone into overdrive in the last, or since it's been in place, to ensure the tightest coordination and cooperation with our three foremost allies in the region, Korea and Japan. And the results have been, as you described, unfortunately, we've seen a high rate of testing, an extraordinary rate of testing by the North Korean regime. But unfortunately, we cannot stop the testing. We cannot deter the testing. But what we can do is deter North Korea from engaging in anything beyond that, an attack. And we've kept North Korea in check through this policy, and I see the Biden administration committed to following this through with an emphasis on denuclearization. Denuclearization, of course, there are many assessments of its effectiveness, and right now you're hearing many academics and experts in the field talking about North Korea is not willing and will not denuclearize, so why proceed with this policy?
And Mr. Rapson just talked about how we cannot stop North Korea from testing missiles, and Ambassador Jeffrey also talked about you don't see any initiatives coming from the Biden administration, and that's why there are calls within the Washington that there needs to be a change in the current course of the Biden administration's North Korea policy. And one of the ideas is to think of the unthinkable, accepting North Korea as a nuclear state. Is this something that is possible for the United States? Any one of you?
Let me get back to the question you just posed to Mr. Rapport, and he would know this better than me, and he deserves some of the credit. Compared to where we were in the Bush administration, the Biden administration has really worked hard to bring together Korea and Japan in a whole series of strategic issues and security issues that are important to all three countries, and that includes, but is not limited to, North Korea. So the priority the administration is placing is to make sure that we are, as you said, in lockstep, not just on North Korea, but to the extent we can on China and other issues, and they've made considerable progress, and that is good. To consider alternatives opens a can of worms as to if you're going to yield on the goal of a totally denuclear peninsula and accept North Korea as a nuclear state, what does that say about nuclear weapons for Japan and South Korea? That is a concern, and that has implications far beyond North Korea, beginning with China, but not limited to that.
So I'm just constantly thinking about what other things can be done. Ambassador Jeffrey, months before you became the special representative for Syria engagement, US, UK, and France shot 100 missiles on Syrian chemical weapons facility. And during the Trump administration, there were considerations of a bloody nose strike. So at this moment, a targeted surgical strike against North Korean nuclear facilities, is it still viable?
It is viable only as a deterrent to some aggressive step beyond testing, as Mr. Rapport mentioned, that we need to deter because of the danger of a war breaking out. But short of that, no. And there's a reason for this that doesn't involve nuclear weapons. It involves the extraordinary artillery capabilities and short-range conventional missile systems that North Korea has, and its ability to rain those systems down on Seoul, not very far from the North Korean border. That is, a conventional retaliatory strike by North Korea is something we cannot prevent. We might be able to, although I doubt it, take out all of their nuclear missile and testing facilities. We certainly cannot take out tens of thousands of artillery pieces and rocket launchers, and that's the retaliatory threat that North Korea has long held over South Korea and thus over the United States. So no, I would rule out, just as the Trump administration did, any kind of bloody nose strike.
Mm-hmm. If North Korea was about to attack South Korea, left of launch, would that be a point where U.S. could consider attacking North Korea?
I think it could be. I don't have the latest insight into war plans, and if I did, I couldn't speak about them. But I would say that that would be a very real consideration, regardless of what the plans say, to strike first to avoid either a nuclear or a conventional Pearl Harbor.
Again, I'm thinking about what other things we can do. And Ambassador John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, was on Washington Talk in October, and he said that he doesn't anticipate diplomacy to ever end North Korea's nuclear program. And regime change is entirely possible, he said. And he also said it is even easier than a country like Iran because there's no need to find a replacement for Kim Jong-un, hereditary communist dictatorship. Now, the U.S., of course, wouldn't openly say we're seeking regime change in North Korea. That wouldn't be an official policy, but sending information into North Korea and then asking North Korea to improve its human rights record, wouldn't this in effect bring about same impact as seeking regime change?
Well, certainly we don't have a policy advocating regime change for a variety of reasons, but if regime change did occur organically through infiltration or greater awareness among the population of what's really going on in the outside world, we certainly support that. And we have programs. I mean, your program here, Voice of America, broadcasts into North Korea. And if it helps open the eyes and expand the awareness of ordinary North Koreans, or even in particular elites who watch the program, then certainly we would support whatever happens organically. But for us to proactively advocate regime change has consequences for the South, for the region, that we have to take into consideration, let alone the possible devastation that would result if it did result in North Korea preemptively reaching out or lashing out with its nuclear arsenal.
If I could jump in, I've worked closely with John Bolton, and he's never seen a problem that he doesn't feel can be solved by regime change. It's just that John, either in his time in the White House or elsewhere, has ever done a successful regime change. And I've been involved on the ground with some unsuccessful ones. It's not really a policy option. The complaining about North Korean human rights neither will produce regime change, nor is that the purpose of the administration. I'm even a bit more cynical than you are. I'm not so sure, and we see this with Russia and Ukraine, and even to a bit with Iran with the current protests. Administrations, unless they're really out to revolutionize the system, which is Bolton's position, but few others, almost are willing to live with the devil they know than the devil they don't know. There's a lot of effort. You do it here at VOA, the government does, and the Japanese and the South Koreans do, to understand Kim Jong-un and what makes him tick and his government tick. If that were to collapse with many dozens of nuclear weapons and delivery systems in the hands of who, Washington might be not very happy with that scenario.
And the Chinese as well would be unhappy or uncertain about that situation with loose nukes, so-called loose nukes, out there in a country which does not have an active leadership.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol told his military officials to trust in the overwhelming nuclear power of our ally nation. Now, when you were the special representative for Syria, U.S. troops pulled out from Syria in 2019. 70% of South Koreans want to develop their own nuclear weapons. How can South Koreans trust in the overwhelming nuclear power of the United States to protect them?
That's a good question, but first of all, a correction. President Trump ordered twice the withdrawal of U.S. troops from northeast Syria. They're still there. There's a lesson there. Just like our troops are still in South Korea now, some 70 years after the Korean War. The United States, as any democratic, sensible country, reviews its military deployments and the risk of war all of the time and makes various decisions. But I am really amazed at how often, with the one exception, that perhaps is the better example, of Afghanistan, of where we have actually withdrawn without accomplishing our mission. We'd actually, long different question, accomplished our basic missions in Vietnam in 72, 73 by the time we withdrew there. So there's very little record of the United States withdrawing. South Korea can rely on the United States to defend it. The issue, however, is once North Korea develops a real capability, and I don't think they're there yet, to bring nuclear-tipped ICBMs onto U.S. territory, you have a different dynamic in providing a nuclear cover for an allied state facing attack. We went through that in the Cold War with Europe. It required forward deployment of tactical nuclear weapons and other things. And so that may require some, I won't say tweaking, but adjustment to our overall posture if once we are convinced that North Korea does have the ICBM and warhead capability to overwhelm our limited but fairly effective missile defense system. Then there would be really time to talk with the South Koreans about possible
North Korea
adjustments.
tested ICBMs 8 times this year, and many of them were successful.
The degree to which they are successful and accurate, and the degree to which they could also carry a miniaturized nuclear warhead, I think is still under study. But they're moving in that direction. You're absolutely right. We are not going to avoid that day. I don't think that day has come yet.
You know, this survey of the Korean public, which seems to suggest that the public overwhelmingly supports the acquisition of nuclear weapons, given that North Korea now has nuclear weapons. I don't know if that survey question has been worded in a way that really reflects the complexity of the issue and the costs that would be associated with if Korea decided to go down the path of acquiring its own nuclear weapons. And I wonder if it was phrased in a more comprehensive way that we might see different results. If indeed, in the question, would the nuclear acquisition be at the expense of the alliance? Because I think that's what's in play here. If South Korea went the nuclear route, it would put the alliance in a very awkward position, and it could unravel the alliance at some point.
But again, looking at our experience over many decades in Europe, where I was a soldier dealing with these things, there are steps you can take to increase nuclear deterrence based upon the United States in the field, short of simply giving nuclear weapons to allies. We haven't done that to any of our allies in NATO, but we have taken a series of steps, some classified, some known to the public in terms of the NATO nuclear posture, that effectively deters the use of nuclear, even conventional strikes on our partners.
But United States share nuclear with NATO.
We have a system whereby NATO aircraft from other countries would have, it's a dual key thing with U.S. Nuclear weapons that they would deliver to targets in the case of a war. But that's short of, we don't give Germany a nuclear capability. Germany cooperates with us on the nuclear program.
Why not South Korea?
As I said, at some point that might be a halfway step, but that's very different than turning nuclear weapons over to South Korea or letting South Korea develop its own nuclear program. Like France says, that's different.
Now I want to look at the synchronized trilateral sanctions actions on North Korea by United States, Japan, and South Korea. Now they did it on the same day. It was not identical, but the designations overlapped one another's previous designations. So, Mr. Rapson, how is this multi-layered, multinational, and synchronized web of sanctions effective?
Well, I think it's effective in reinforcing the fact that the allies are working closely together. They're not doing things individually on their own, but it's a policy whereby we consult with each other closely and agree on the measures that we should take and do it in an effective way that reinforces our posture. So the sanctions in and of themselves won't make a big difference, I don't think, but the fact that they were applied collectively at the same time and it will have some targeted impact, I think is a solid piece of diplomacy by the U.S. in close coordination with Seoul and Tokyo.
Ambassador Jeffrey, Senator Marco Rubio said that the action was toothless because North Koreans does not have U.S. bank accounts, will not ever travel to U.S. or South Korea or Japan. What is your take? And do you agree with the critics that the Biden administration is not fully enforcing North Korea sanctions?
I would say yes and no, and I would go back to not just the comments by my colleague, but also those of Mr. Campbell earlier. Remember, as you said, he said our policy is both effective and prudent. In terms of diplomatic tradecraft that Mr. Rapport and I have spent most of our lives doing, this sanction policy is very good because we maintain two things. One is solidarity among the members of this alliance, if you will, vis-a-vis North Korea, U.S., South Korea, and Japan. Secondly, it was done in a coordinated fashion as opposed to many of our diplomatic disasters, and it lays down a marker, as we say. If you do bad things, we won't not do anything.
Right.
But now we get to Senator Rubio's criticism. Of course it's toothless. It's not going to change anything. But that's okay. What it does is it preserves the more important diplomatic relations between these three key players. It builds up confidence that we at least talk to each other and we don't go off and do things on our own. We're predictable. Those are all valuable things in diplomacy, even if it doesn't change a thing the other side does. It strengthens our side, and that's a good in and of itself.
Mr. Rapson, Ambassador Jeffrey just talked about how effective sanctions are, and we're now in a deadlock in negotiation with North Korea, and some observers say that we should give concession to North Korea. We should give sanctions relief to North Korea. Is that something that should be considered at this point?
Well, that's a strategic decision, and the Biden administration has not made that, as opposed it. They said they are not going to bring incentives to bring North Korea back to the table, which means sanctions relief. So until someone at the most senior levels has crossed that policy threshold, we're going to maintain the course here. That is the strategic strategic question. Is there anything we should do, could do, will do to incentivize North Korea to come back to the table? And that's left us where we are, the status quo, deadlocked for now. And my concern is that as we go up in this escalatory cycle of testing and then countermeasures, defense drills, exercising, it builds a risk factor into the equation of miscalculation, given now North Korea has laid out a protocol for using its nuclear assets, a process by which even if the leader is gone or not able, there is a chain of command by which they can go ahead and deploy. So the risk factor has grown, and it's incumbent on certainly our side to be tightly in sync as to how we're going to jointly approach this. We can't afford to have any loose action in response to escalatory measures by the North.
Recent comments from the U.S. officials, they criticized China for not doing much. NSC Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby says, thus far, they have shown no desire to really put the kind of pressure on North Korea. Admiral John Aquilino said China had no motivation to restrain any country, including North Korea, that was generating problems for the United States. So at this point, do you think the United States should exclude and not think about China in drawing up a strategy on North Korea? And should the U.S. go after China and punish China for not helping with North Korea?
Okay, a couple of different questions there. First of all, to answer your last two, no, it shouldn't punish China, and yes, it cannot think about North Korea without thinking about China. But let's take the two comments by Kirby on the one hand and Admiral Aquilino on the other. That reflects, as I said at the beginning, a paradigm change in how we look at the world between 1989 and up to a few years ago and how we're looking at it now. Kirby is still pushing the buttons of where we were in 1997 in the Clinton administration or 2004 in the Bush administration and on, that the world has solved all of its big strategic problems. It just has to deal with all these individual problems, and everybody, including the Chinese, the Russians, have an interest in that. That's not any longer true. Admiral Aquilino gets it right. China sees itself in a global confrontation with the United States, not so much with the international order, that's a more complicated question, but certainly with the United States, and therefore the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's what we're dealing with. The Admiral has it right. Kirby is just blowing smoke. He's a wonderful guy, but in this case he is. He's also an Admiral.
Congressman Steve Chabot said to pressure China to use leverage on North Korea, we should explore at least talks with both South Korea and Japan about the countries having nuclear programs themselves. Will the prospect of a nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia somehow push China to be more helpful in North Korea issue?
Well, that's a very slippery slope, opening up the Pandora's box if we engaged in discussion that led to a pathway or a U.S. endorsement of either Seoul and or Tokyo to pursue a nuclear path, and I think that's something we want to keep in the box. It's a tactic that really isn't ready for prime time, and we have much other business with the Chinese to take care of. But this is a consequence of the China factors. It's a consequence of our current relationship with China. There's collateral damage, and the Chinese transactional in nature are not going to do us any favors. So we got to make it in their interest to work on North Korea as we've done in the past. And if we can put some pressure on them, shame them, in some fashion, as I think South Korea is doing and we're doing, sure, let's go down that path. But any expectation that we're going to coerce them and bring them back to the table to work on the table with North Korea, I don't think so.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Rapson, Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.